What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you sold you to a stranger just to save themselves? What if the cruelest thing that ever happened to you turned out to be the door that led you home? And what if the most powerful man in the most dangerous city in South Korea had been watching you for months, not as prey, but as the only woman he had ever seen worth protecting? This is the story of Emma Osai, a woman born between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. A woman who scrubbed marble floors in a house that should have been her inheritance. A woman who was traded like a debt note and walked into that transaction not as a victim, but as the most underestimated piece on a very dangerous board. They called her the leftover daughter. He called her his queen. And by the time Seoul understood what had happened, it was already too late. Before we begin, if you're new here, welcome. Don't forget to subscribe right now. You don't want to miss what's coming. And drop your location in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the story. The Han River runs through Seoul like a scar that never healed, and on the northern side of that river, in the old money hills of Seongbukdong, sat the Yoon estate, a compound of pale stone and dark wood that had once been called beautiful. Now it just looked expensive. There is a difference between beauty and expense that only people with nothing have learned to see. Emma Osai saw it every morning. She saw it in the way the floors gleamed under her hands, her knuckles raw from the cleaning solution she mixed herself because Madame Yoon refused to buy the gentler kind. She saw it in the way the jade figurines on the mantel were polished to a mirror shine while the woman who polished them ate last, if at all. She saw it in the way the crystal chandeliers were turned on full every time guests arrived, transforming the foyer into a cathedral of light, while the wing where Emma slept had a flickering bulb that no one ever replaced. Emma was 23 years old. She had been in this house since she was 19, and she had spent 4 years becoming invisible. Her father, Dr. Emmanuel Osai, had been a Ghanaian economist, a brilliant, gentle man who had loved one country deeply and then chosen to love another. Emma's mother, a Ghanaian woman of fierce grace and quiet laughter, had died when Emma was barely 5 years old, a fever that came fast and left nothing. And so Emmanuel had done what grief sometimes compels. He packed what remained of their life in Accra into 2 suitcases and boarded a plane to Seoul, where a university position waited, and where he believed, perhaps, that a new country might carry less weight than the one that held his wife's grave. Emma grew up in Seoul. She learned Korean in the way children learn things, without effort, without theory, the language seeping into her bones alongside the smell of doenjang jjiggy and the sound of summer rain on a tin roof. She became, in the truest sense, a child of 2 places. Her father built his life carefully. He was meticulous, principled, respected in the academic and economic circles of a city that was not always generous to outsiders. He raised Emma alone for 9 years, and those 9 years were the best of her life. A life of small, bright things, of her father's stories and his bad Korean puns, and the way he held her face in his hands when she cried and told her that she was made of 2 rivers, and that made her stronger than either one alone. Then loneliness found him, as loneliness always eventually does. Park Hana arrived in their life with the precision of someone who had been looking for exactly this, a good man with a good income and a daughter who was too young to understand what was being built around her. She was charming, beautiful, and possessed of a hunger for security that had no ceiling. She came with a daughter of her own, Jisoo, and within 2 years she had become the second Mrs. Osai. The wedding had been beautiful. His death, 5 years later, had been sudden and total, a stroke that claimed him on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper. The funeral flowers were still wilting when Park Hana changed the locks. Not literally. The locks stayed the same. What changed was the temperature of the house. What changed was the way Park Hana's eyes moved when Emma entered a room, scanning her the way a shopkeeper scans a customer she suspects of stealing. What changed was the language of the household, the way instructions were given, the way meals were served, the way the word daughter asterisk was used only for Jisoo now, and never, ever for Emma. Emma's mother had existed only in photographs and in Emmanuel's stories. Those photographs had been moved from the walls within a month of the second wedding. Her belongings, the kente cloth Emmanuel had kept framed above the bedroom window, the record collection of high-life music that Emma had grown up falling asleep to, had been boxed and stored, and then the storage room had been repurposed as a walk-in closet for Jisoo. By the time Emmanuel Osai was buried in the ground, his legacy was a ledger of debt. Not because he had been careless, but because Park Hana had spent 5 years quietly diverting his assets, funds meant for Emma's education, the property in Mapogu that he had kept in her name, the investment portfolio his own father had built from nothing in Accra. All of it redirected, dissolved, absorbed by a woman who had perfected the art of consuming without leaving fingerprints. And so Emma stayed. Not because she was weak. She stayed because there was nowhere to go. Her father's only blood family was in Accra, and she had grown up in Seoul. She was more Korean in her habits and her tongue than Ghanaian, and yet not Korean enough for this city to claim her as its own. She had no degree. Park Hana had engineered a series of financial disruptions that had forced her to defer twice and then withdraw entirely. She had no savings. She had no standing in the Yoon family structure, legally or emotionally. She had the room in the east wing with the flickering bulb. She had the cleaning supplies. She had her hands, her mind, and the quiet, unshakable kernel of something that Park Hana had tried for 4 years to crush and had not yet managed to reach. Emma called it her father's voice, the part of him that still lived in her chest, speaking low and steady when everything else was chaos, saying, "You are not what they are making you." She held onto that voice the way a drowning woman holds a rope. Every night after the house went quiet and Jisoo's laughter had faded from the upper floors, Emma sat in her narrow room with a second-hand notebook and wrote. She wrote everything. Not just the daily humiliations, though she wrote those too, in precise, clinical detail, because she had always believed that nomming a thing correctly is the first step toward surviving it, but also her father's teachings. The economic theories he had explained to her over dinner, the Korean proverbs he had repeated wrong until she laughed, the way he had held her face in his hands and told her that she was made of 2 rivers, and that made her stronger than either one alone. She did not know that somewhere in the city, someone else had also been watching the House of Yoon. She did not know that the debt Park Hana had accumulated over 4 years of reckless spending had reached a ceiling. And she did not know that the collector had already decided what form the payment would take. His name was Han Sejin. If you lived in Seoul and moved in certain circles, you didn't say that name above a whisper. You said it the way you might say the name of a storm that was already on the horizon, with respect, with fear, and with the quiet hope that it would pass you by. Han Sejin was 31 years old. He was the youngest head of the Han family organization in 3 generations, a conglomerate that operated on the surface as a private equity firm, a luxury real estate group, and a charitable foundation. Beneath that surface was a structure of debt collection, contract enforcement, and the kind of informal governance that kept certain neighborhoods in certain parts of Seoul running without the need for City Hall. The Han family were not criminals in the theatrical sense. They were architects. They built systems, and those systems had teeth. Sejin had been groomed for this role since adolescence. He was meticulous, disciplined, and ruthlessly rational. He operated from a glass-end concrete tower in Gangnam that offered a panoramic view of the city he had quietly made his own. He had also, for the past 14 months, operated from a wheelchair. The story the city had been told was simple. A car accident on the highway between Seoul and Busan. Severe spinal trauma. Partial paralysis. The brilliant, frightening heir apparent of the Han family, reduced to a wheelchair and the slow, humbling business of rehabilitation. The city had adjusted accordingly. His lieutenants had grown bolder. His rivals had stopped hiding their ambitions. The whisper network that ran through the criminal and corporate underbelly of Seoul had reached a consensus. Han Sejin was finished. A king without his legs was a king in name only. The chair was not a throne. It was a cage. What the city did not know was that the accident had not been an accident. What the city did not know was that Sejin had been standing in his private gym every morning for 11 months. What the city did not know was that the wheelchair was a test, and most people had failed it. Now the debt had come due for Park Hana. She had borrowed from Han-affiliated lenders over a period of 4 years, using Emmanuel Osai's name and assets as collateral she had no right to pledge. The total, with accumulated interest and penalties, was a figure that turned the air in a room cold when it was spoken aloud. The lenders had been patient. They were done being patient. Park Hana received the envoy in the Yoon estate's formal sitting room, a place she had redecorated 3 times in 4 years at other people's expense. She sat rigidly upright, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into an expression of practiced dignity that was, Emma noted from the hallway where she stood invisible with a tray of tea no one had asked for, beginning to crack at the edges. The envoy was a man named Oh Kwang-soo, quiet, compact, and dressed in a suit that cost more than the furniture he sat on. He placed a folder on the lacquered table and let it sit there for a moment before speaking. "The debt is not negotiable," he said. "The interest has been patient. My employer has not asked for the land or the assets. He is asking for something more practical." Park Hana's jaw tightened. "What does he want?" "He wants a wife," Oh Kwang-soo said, as if he were describing a weather forecast. "Not a romance, a contract, an alliance that stabilizes certain questions about the Han family's public legitimacy. A wife from the Yoon family bloodline satisfies a condition in a covenant that goes back 2 generations. The debt is forgiven completely. The Yoon name is protected, and the woman in question lives in one of the most secure residences in the country." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. "The woman in question," Park Hana repeated slowly. "Jisoo would be the expectation," Oh Kwang-soo said. "She is the Yoon heir." From the hallway, Emma felt the words settle over the room like a weather change. She watched Park Hana's face, the flicker of calculation, the rapid, silent arithmetic of a woman who had spent 4 years treating her stepchild like furniture and now faced a bill she could not pay alone. She watched Jisoo, who had appeared in the doorway of the adjacent room and was listening with her arms crossed, her face doing something Emma had never seen it do before. Fear. Real fear. Jisoo was 25, beautiful by every standard the city applied to beauty, tall, carefully curated, trained since adolescence in the social performance of the upper class. She had never worked a day in her life. She had never been told no in a way that lasted. She wore her mother's ruthlessness with better packaging. And right now, she looked like a woman who had just heard the sound of a door closing behind her. "I need time," Park Hana said. "You have 48 hours, Oh Kwang-soo replied. He picked up the folder, stood, and left. In the hallway, Emma set down the tray she had been holding for 20 minutes and walked back to the kitchen. She did not yet know that the next 48 hours would be the last she spent as the leftover daughter. That night, Emma heard the argument through the walls. Not the words, the walls in the East Wing were thick, a detail that had always felt less like architecture and more like intention, but the shape of it. The low, urgent current of Park Hana's voice, and the sharper, higher pitch of Jisoo's response, and then the sound of something being thrown, and then a door slamming so hard the flicker in Emma's bulb stuttered. She lay on her narrow bed in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and listened to the house breathe. She had survived 4 years in this house by developing a sensitivity to its moods, the way a sailor reads a sky. She knew the difference between ordinary tension and the kind of tension that precedes a shift. She had felt shifts before. The shift when her father died. The shift when the school called to say her tuition had been returned. The shift when the last photograph of her mother disappeared from the hallway. This felt like a shift of a different magnitude. She was right. 3 days later, Jisoo vanished. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way which was somehow worse. Emma found out the way she found out most things in that house, through what was left behind rather than what was said. The closet in Jisoo's room, usually overflowing, had been strategically thinned. Specific things were gone. The small cash reserve Jisoo kept in a silk envelope under her vanity, the passport that was usually locked in the household safe. The photograph she kept beside her bed, not the family portrait, but the one of the young man Emma had seen twice, glimpsed briefly through a car window, never introduced. Park Hana found out the same morning. The sound that came from the master bedroom at 6 a.m. was not grief. It was not shock. It was the sound of a woman who had just watched her primary asset walk out the door and was already recalculating. Emma was in the kitchen making tea. She was not planning to offer to anyone when Park Hana appeared in the doorway. She was immaculate, hair set, silk robe pressed. Only her eyes gave anything away, and what they gave away was the cold, surgical focus of a woman who had decided. "Come upstairs," Park Hana said. Emma turned slowly. "Why?" "Because I'm telling you to." There are moments in a life that you recognize, even as they're happening, as the kind of moment that will not unhappen. Emma recognized this one. She could feel it in the air, in the way Park Hana's gaze moved over her, not with contempt this time, but with the measuring, appraising attention she usually reserved for things she was about to use. She followed her upstairs. What happened in the next 20 minutes was something that would take Emma years to fully understand. Not the events themselves, those were clear enough. Park Hana pulled a dress from the back of Jisoo's wardrobe, a structured ivory and gold silk hanbok, a modernized design that moved like water, that had been made for the formal meeting scheduled for that afternoon with Han Sejin's household. She told Emma to put it on. Emma refused. Park Hana grabbed her wrist and said, in a voice stripped of everything but naked, bone-level desperation, that if Han Sejin's men arrived this afternoon and found no Yoon daughter waiting, the consequences would not end at the estate's walls. "He has never seen Jisoo's face in person," Park Hana said. "The contract says a Yoon family daughter. You are Emmanuel Osai's daughter. Emmanuel Osai married into the Yoon family. That is close enough to satisfy the letter of the document. You keep your head down, you sign, you go. The debt disappears. This house survives." Emma stared at her. "And me?" she asked. Park Hana met her gaze without blinking. "You survive too," she said. "You've been surviving in this house for 4 years on nothing. At least this way you're surviving somewhere better." It was the most honest thing Park Hana had ever said to her. And it was still a betrayal. Emma thought of her father. She thought of his voice in her chest. She thought of the notebook under her mattress, the 4 years of careful documentation, the flickering bulb, the raw hands, the photographs that had been erased from the walls. She thought of the fact that she had nowhere else to go. And then she thought of something else. She thought, if I'm walking into this, I'm walking in with my eyes open. She put on the dress. The Han residence in Gangnam-gu occupied the top 4 floors of a tower that seemed to have been built by someone who understood that height is power. Emma was escorted up in an elevator that moved silently, surrounded by men in dark suits whose faces were professionally blank. She stood straight. She breathed deliberately. She kept her hands still, a harder task than it should have been, because her hands had a tendency to give her away when her mind was working, and her mind was working very hard. The elevator opened into a reception room that was the kind of beautiful that makes your chest ache, floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over Seoul at dusk. The city laid out below like a circuit board alight with a billion small intentions. The furniture was spare, confident, chosen by someone who understood that space was its own kind of statement. Sitting at the far end of the room, beside the window, in a wheelchair that she had not expected to feel so present, was Han Sejin. She had prepared herself for the version of him she had heard described. The monster, the broken king, the fearsome creditor in decline. She had not prepared for the reality of him. He was still, not the stillness of a man at rest. The stillness of a man who had chosen, precisely, not to move. His shoulders were squared. His hands rested on the armrests with the deliberate ease of someone who had trained himself out of every nervous habit. His face was, she searched for the word, composed asterisk, in the way that suggests the composition has been hard won. His eyes, when they found her, did not move over her the way she had expected. They did not scan for beauty or assess for status. They looked at her as if they already knew her. Which, as it turned out, they did. The meeting was conducted in near silence, and Emma, who had been instructed by Park Hana to say as little as possible, to keep her head slightly lowered, to let the household staff do the talking, found herself in the strange position of feeling seen more clearly in her silence than she ever had in her speech. Han Sejin said almost nothing. He asked her one question. "Are you here because you want to be?" It was the last question she had expected. She looked up at him, which she had been told not to do, and found him watching her with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, but precise, the way a mathematician looks at a problem they already know the answer to. "No," she said. It was the first honest answer anyone had given in that building all day. Something shifted in his face, just slightly, just enough that if you hadn't been watching carefully, you would have missed it. He looked down at her hands. Later, she would understand what that look meant. The contract was signed. Emma Osai, standing in an ivory and gold hanbok in a glass tower above Seoul, signed her name on a document that changed her life in more ways than she understood yet. Park Hana's debt was cleared within the hour, and Emma was driven, in a black car through the evening streets of the city her father had loved, to a life she could not yet imagine. Part 5, The Tower and the Truth. Her room in the Han residence was larger than the entire east wing of the Yoon estate. She stood in it for a long time the first night, not touching anything. She had been introduced to the household staff, who were deferential in a way that felt foreign after 4 years of being the one who deferred. She had been shown the closet, full of clothes in her size, colors she actually liked, not Jisoo's cast-offs, and the bathroom with water that ran hot without being requested, and the desk by the window where someone had placed a fresh notebook and 3 different kinds of pens. That undid her a little, the notebook. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. She was not safe. She knew that. She was inside a system far more dangerous than the one she had left. The man whose name she had signed beside was the most feared figure in a world she did not fully understand. The contract she had signed had implications she was still processing. But the bulb above her didn't flicker. And her hands, for the first time in 4 years, had nothing to scrub. Han Sejin did not speak to her for 2 days. He was present. She was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, a kind of atmospheric pressure. But he did not seek her out, did not make demands, did not perform the role of the dangerous husband she had been preparing herself for. On the 3rd morning, she woke early and found him in the kitchen. Not being waited on, making tea himself with the focused precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The wheelchair was positioned beside the counter. His hands moved competently. He did not seem startled to find her there. He said, "There is a chair at the table." She sat. He placed a cup in front of her. They drank tea in silence for 11 minutes. She counted, because counting was the thing she did when she needed to keep herself from doing something rash, like crying or speaking too honestly, or both. On the 12th minute, he said, "I know you aren't Jisoo." The tea was very good. She put down the cup carefully and said, "Since when?" "Since the first photograph Park Hana submitted to our background process," he replied. 6 weeks ago." She stared at him. 6 weeks, she repeated. "Your hands gave you away first," he said. "The woman in the photograph had the hands of someone who worked. Jisoo-yoon does not work. I had the discrepancy investigated." He paused. "I know who your father was. I knew him, in fact, not personally, by reputation. He was one of the most principled economists this city has seen in 30 years. He was also one of the only men who ever publicly refused a contract from our family and lived to write about it." Emma felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "Why didn't you cancel the arrangement?" she asked. Han Sejin looked at her with that same precise, unhurried attention. "Because I had been watching what was happening in that house," he said. "For longer than 6 weeks. I have eyes in many places, Emma. I watched what they did to you. I watched you work double shifts at the convenience store in Mapogu on the nights they turned off the heat. I watched you at the street market on Saturdays, buying vegetables with money you had saved in a tin you kept inside a textbook, because you knew that if they found cash, they would take it. He set down his own cup. I watched a woman being systematically erased by people who were terrified of what she would become if she was allowed to stand up straight. Emma's throat was very tight. "And," she said, because she needed him to finish. "And I decided," Han Sejin said quietly, "that the only thing worth trading the Han family's protection for was someone who had already proven she could survive without it." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Emma had known. Not because they were without tension. There was tension, yes. The quiet, charged tension of two people learning to read each other in a space that was intimate by legal contract, and still navigating what it meant to choose each other in the ways that actually counted. But Han Sejin was unexpected. He did not explain himself often, but when he did, he was precise. He did not make promises he didn't intend to keep, which meant his promises were rare and weighed heavily. He listened when she spoke in a way that made her feel like the words were being stored, not just heard. He corrected her exactly twice in those first weeks. Once about a strategic miscalculation she had made in her assessment of one of his business decisions. Once about a piece of Korean legal history she had gotten slightly wrong, and both times he did it without condescension, as if the correction itself was a form of respect. He brought her into his work. Slowly at first, then more fully. He sat her at the table during briefings. He had her read contracts. He asked her what she saw that he might be missing, and when she told him, cautiously at first, and then with increasing directness as she understood that he meant the question, he took what she said and used it. She learned, over those weeks, the shape of his world. She also began to understand the shape of him. The accident that had put him in the wheelchair 14 months ago had not been chance. It had been orchestrated by men inside his own organization, senior figures who had been waiting years for an opportunity to move against him, and had decided that the chaos following his father's death was their window. They had arranged for the crash on the highway. They had expected him to die, or to emerge so compromised that the question of succession would resolve itself without them having to act openly. They had not expected him to survive. They had not expected him to recover as fully as he had, and they certainly had not expected him to keep that recovery hidden, operating from the wheelchair while he identified each of them, documented their treachery, and built a case that would end not just their careers but their entire networks. "Why tell me?" Emma asked him one evening, when he had just finished explaining all of this with the quiet, level delivery of a man who had been carrying the weight of it alone for over a year. He looked at her. "Because you are the only person in my life right now," he said, "who has no interest in the Han family power structure. You didn't come here to advance your standing. You came here with nothing, and you've been honest about that from the first moment. That makes you the only person I can actually trust." She thought about that for a long time. "That's a terrible way to live," she said finally. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Yes," he agreed, "it is." "Then stop," she said. He looked at her, as if she had said something unexpected. "Stop carrying it alone," she clarified. "I'm here, use me properly." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. It was the silence of a decision being made. 3 weeks after that conversation, Sejin came to find her. It was late. The city outside was its nighttime self, all lit glass and dark water, beautiful in the specific way that Seoul is beautiful after midnight, which is to say both hard and soft at once, unapologetic and deeply lonely. She was at the desk by the window, writing in the notebook. She had filled 40 pages in 3 weeks, which was a record even for her. There was a lot to process. She heard his wheelchair, the familiar low hum of the motor, and she marked her page and turned. He was at the center of the room. He had positioned himself with precision, the way he did everything, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, stripped of its usual careful management, raw in a way that felt almost dangerous on him, like watching something armored take off its shell. "I need to show you something," he said. All right, she said. He placed his hands on the armrests. She watched him breathe, one breath, measured, deliberate, the breath of a man who has decided to stop holding something back. And then Hans Sejin stood up. The world did not end. The room did not transform. There was no dramatic sound. But Emma felt the air leave her lungs completely. He was tall. She had not fully understood how tall from the wheelchair. He was broad through the shoulders, and when he took the first step toward her, his movement had the careful, precise quality of someone who had spent months relearning the confidence of his own body. Not weak, but aware. A kind of earned grace that was somehow more powerful than any casual strength she had ever seen. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. He was close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look up at him, and she did, her heart doing something loud and unruly behind her ribs. 11 months, he said. I have been able to walk for 11 months. No one knows, not my lieutenants, not my rivals, not the men who tried to kill me, who have been growing confident for the last year because they think the king is still in his cage. He paused. I needed a wife who wasn't part of their world, someone who wouldn't accidentally reveal what she'd seen, someone I could trust with the one thing that, if it came out at the wrong moment, could undo everything. And you chose me, Emma said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I chose you, he confirmed. Because I had nowhere to go and no reason to talk. Because, he said, his voice dropping into something that was not performative, that was simply true. I watched you for months, and in all that time, in every situation where a smaller person would have grown bitter or broken, you did not. You stayed honest. You stayed precise. You kept writing in that notebook even when they took everything else. You helped an elderly man cross a street in the rain outside a convenience store at 11 p.m. even though you were exhausted and alone. He reached out and, with a deliberateness that was, in its own way, a kind of prayer, placed his hand against her jaw. I have been surrounded my entire life by people who want things from me. You are the first person I have met in a very long time who simply is asterisk. Exactly what you appear to be. Emma looked at him. I'm not a saint, she said. I'm angry. I've been angry for 4 years. Good, he said quietly. I need someone who knows what they're fighting for. She thought of her father. She thought of the 2 rivers he had said she was made of. She thought of the flickering bulb and the raw hands and the 40 pages in the notebook. She put her hand over his and held it there. Then tell me the plan, she said. He did. It began at the Han Foundation's annual benefit gala. A crystalline, ruthless event held in a converted Hanok palace in the heart of Bukshan, where old money and new power wore their finest clothes and assessed each other with the warmth of tax audits. Seoul's social world had been watching Emma for weeks. The photographs had been circulating. The new Mrs. Han, photographed stepping out of black cars, attending private dinners, appearing at the side of the man in the wheelchair with a composure that was somehow both warm and impenetrable. She wore clothes that seemed to understand her body rather than demand things of it. She spoke Korean with an accent that layered Ghanaian intonation over a Seoul cadence, and somehow the combination was not jarring but musical. She was, the city had decided, magnetic. This both fascinated and infuriated the precise people Sejin had needed it to infuriate. Park Hana had been watching from a distance for weeks, her envy metastasizing into something operational. She had called Jisoo. She had called in old favors with a gossip journalist she had cultivated for years. She had assembled what she believed was a devastating account: the bride swap, the fraud, the servant girl who had stolen a throne. She had also, fatally, underestimated Han Sejin. They arrived at the gala together. Emma was wearing a gown that had taken 3 fittings, structured indigo silk, with kente print detailing woven into the hem and cuffs. A collaboration between a Korean designer and a Ghanaian textile artist that Sejin had commissioned specifically, because he had understood before she articulated it that she did not want to belong to one world only, that she was most powerful when she was most fully herself. She wheeled him into the room. Which was not a diminishment. It was a choice. They had discussed it precisely. The wheelchair was a final gift to the men who thought they had broken him, one last night of their comfortable certainty before the ground moved. Park Hana was there. She had arrived early, positioned herself strategically. She had brought Jisoo, who looked less triumphant than her mother and more like someone who had made a decision she was already regretting. Emma saw them across the room. She did not look away. Park Hana moved through the crowd with the practiced speed of someone executing a plan. She found the cluster of senior Han family figures, gray-templed men with cold, powerful faces, and she told her story with a precision that suggested rehearsal. She produced photographs, Emma in her convenience store uniform, taken on one of the many nights she'd worked past midnight. Documents, Emmanuel Osai's debts, misrepresented to suggest financial manipulation. The narrative, a desperate, scheming girl who had impersonated a Yoon heir and entrapped the Han family's most powerful figure. She spoke loudly enough that the surrounding crowd could hear. The room began to shift. Jisoo, emboldened, moved toward Sejun's wheelchair. She crouched beside him, her voice dropped into a register that she had calibrated to be both urgent and intimate, her fingers brushing toward his arm. "She lied to you," Jisoo said. "She's not who you think she is. I'm the one who was promised. Let me make this right." Han Sejun did not look at her. He looked at Emma. She met his gaze across the room, and what passed between them in that look had nothing to do with the crowd or the noise or the story being told about her. It was the look of two people who had been honest with each other in the dark, and now had no reason to be anything less in the light. She gave the smallest nod. He placed his hands on the armrests. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something irreversible is happening. Han Sejun rose from the wheelchair. He stood to his full height in the center of the ballroom, under the light of the restored Hanok's lanterns, and the silence that fell was total. The silence of a city that had decided he was finished, now confronting the evidence of its own miscalculation. He turned his gaze first to the men who had tried to kill him. They were in the room. Of course they were. He had made sure of it. They had the look, now, of people watching the floor fall away beneath them. Then he spoke. "For 14 months, he said, his voice carrying through the silence with the ease of a man who had spent his whole life making rooms listen. "You have been making decisions based on a version of me that I allowed you to see. You decided I was broken. You decided my house was weakened. You decided the chair was a cage." He let the pause sit. "You were wrong." He turned then to Park Hana, who had gone the color of old ash. "You came here tonight to destroy a woman you treated like furniture for 4 years, he said. "You brought receipts for her poverty and called it evidence of her fraud. You have confused her survival with dishonesty." He looked at Emma, crossed to her in 3 deliberate steps, his stride steady and unhurried, and stood beside her. His hand found the small of her back, a gesture that was not possessive but steadying, the way you stand beside someone you are committed to standing beside. "I knew who she was before I signed any contract. I chose her, not the name she arrived under, not the house she came from, her. And anyone in this room who has a problem with that choice is welcome to bring it to me directly." The men who had ordered his accident were already moving toward the exits. They didn't get far. Park Hana's manufactured evidence was swept from the table it had been laid on. Jisoo, for the first time in her life, had nothing to say. The news broke slowly, then all at once. Han Sejun's recovery, and the circumstances of his concealment, was the story. The internal treachery within the Han organization, documented and submitted to the appropriate authorities, dismantled a network that had been operating in the shadows for years. It was precise. It was devastating. It was exactly what a man who had spent 14 months planning from a wheelchair, or, more accurately, planning while appearing to be asterisk in a wheelchair, would execute. The gossip about Emma was brief. It did not stick. Because the story that replaced it was better. The story of the Ghanaian woman raised in Seoul who had been sold as payment for a debt and had walked into that arrangement with enough intelligence and dignity to earn the genuine trust of the most formidable man in the city. That was not a story that reduced her. It was a story that expanded her. Seoul adjusted. Emma went back to the Unistate once. She went in the morning, in daylight, with Sejun walking beside her, not for theater, but because she had asked him to come and he had come, because that is what it means when two people have decided to stand on the same side of things. Park Hana and Jisoo were there, pale, smaller seeming than she remembered. Emma placed the documents on the table her father had bought at a market in Insadong 30 years ago, the table she had scrubbed until her knuckles bled, the table that was, now, among the assets returned to her name as part of the legal resolution of the estate. "The debt my father owed has been cleared," she said. "The properties misappropriated under his name have been returned. You have until the end of the month to vacate." She looked at Park Hana, not with hatred, which she had expected to feel, and not with forgiveness, which she was not yet ready for, but with the clean, precise feeling of someone putting something down that they have been carrying for too long. "I am not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because it is correct. There is a difference." She picked up the one thing she had come specifically to retrieve, a small framed photograph from the room that had once been storage and was now a closet. Her mother, the woman who had died in Accra before Emma, was old enough to hold the memory properly, whose face she had spent 18 years trying to memorize from photographs. Caught in a garden somewhere mid-laugh, caught by a camera she hadn't known was pointed at her. She held it carefully. She walked out. That evening, Emma sat at the window in their home, a phrase she was still learning to say without bracing for it to be taken away. And she held her mother's photograph in one hand and her father's voice in her chest, and she let herself feel the full weight of what the last several months had been. Sejin came and sat beside her. Not in the wheelchair, just beside her, in the chair by the window, close enough that their arms touched. "My father used to say I was made of two rivers," she said. Sejin looked at the photograph, at the Ghanaian woman in the garden mid-laugh, the woman Emma had been trying to know from a distance her whole life. What did he mean? "He meant that I had two countries in me, two cultures, two languages, two sets of history. And he said that made me stronger than either one because two rivers don't cancel each other out. They merge. They become something larger than what they were separately." Sejin was quiet for a moment. "He was right," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I just had to get somewhere I could stand up straight long enough to see it." He took her hand. Outside, Seoul glittered in the dark. That great, relentless, luminous city of 10 million people going about the business of their lives, carrying their secrets and their griefs and their small daily victories, unaware of the specific woman in the specific window who had survived a very particular set of circumstances and come through them not diminished, but enlarged. Not untouched. You do not come through 4 years of being made invisible and emerge without marks. The marks are real. They will always be real. But marks and wounds are different things. Wounds close. Marks remain and become part of the story. Emma looked at her hands, no longer raw, no longer the hands of a servant, and thought about everything they had held and everything they had written and everything they had refused to let go of in the years when letting go would have been so much easier. She thought about the notebook under the mattress in the East Wing, all those pages of careful documentation, and she smiled a little because she understood now what it had been for, all that writing in the dark. It had been for this. It had been the practice of trusting that her story was worth recording, even when no one else seemed to agree. They sold her like a closing payment on a life they had already spent. They thought they were rid of her. They thought she was the leftover, the thing you don't value until it's gone, and then it's too late. But here is what they never understood about Emma Osei. She had been learning, in that house, in that East Wing, in that flicker of a borrowed bulb. She had been learning exactly what she was made of. And she was made of two rivers. Two rivers that merge, remember, do not lose their names. They gain a new one. The Yoon estate passed into new ownership before spring. Park Hana and Jisoo relocated, quietly, to a smaller life in a smaller city, and the social circles that had once received them found, gradually, that they had less and less to offer. Han Sejin dismantled the network that had tried to kill him, piece by careful piece, the way you dismantle anything built on fear, by refusing to be afraid. Emma finished the book she had been writing, not the notebook, though that became an appendix of sorts, but a longer thing, a memoir and an economic analysis at once, dedicated to her father, who had understood that the most powerful currency in any system is the truth told plainly and without apology. It was published in Seoul and across simultaneously. The dedication read, "For Emmanuel Osai, who taught me that two rivers don't choose between their sources. They carry both all the way to the sea." And Seoul, which had called her the leftover daughter, which had watched her arrive in a borrowed dress at the side of a broken king. Seoul learned, as cities always eventually do, that the people it underestimates are under no obligation to stay underestimated. She had never asked for a throne. She had simply refused, for 4 years and then for all the years that followed, to kneel. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the power. It's the one who decided, quietly in the dark, that they were worth fighting for. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do for the person being overlooked is to be the first one to see them.